History is filled with stories of kings and their battles, but hidden between those grand tales are the voices that were silenced before they could ever speak. In the heart of medieval England, where crowns meant power and marriages were weapons, one of the most unsettling alliances was forged. A 6-year-old girl, innocent and fragile, married to a king nearly 30 years her senior. Imagine a child still learning to read, still discovering the world, suddenly placed on a throne, her childhood stolen by duty. She wore a crown not as a symbol of triumph, but as a chain that bound her to a life she never chose. This forgotten queen story is more than a chapter in dusty history books. It is a mirror reflecting the ruthless politics of the time, when family honor outweighed innocence and kingdoms were worth more than childhood. Her life forces us to ask an uncomfortable question: how many more untold stories lie buried beneath the glitter of royal crowns? Today, we uncover the life of the little girl who became a queen too soon, and whose silent tragedy remains one of England's most haunting secrets. In the grand timeline of English history, we often remember the thunder of battles, the rise and fall of dynasties, and the kings who carved their names in glory. But hidden behind those shining crowns and glorious victories are stories that are far more unsettling. Stories of children who were never given a chance to live as children because their lives were bound to power, politics, and royal duty. This is the story of one such girl, a forgotten queen of England, who became a bride before she even understood what marriage meant. It is difficult for us today, in the modern world, to imagine a child at the tender age of 6 being dressed in regal robes, crowned with jewels far too heavy for her little head, and given away in marriage to a man 29 years old. Yet in the harsh and merciless world of medieval politics, this was not an act of love but a strategy, an alliance crafted not by hearts, but by hands eager to control kingdoms and secure power. Childhood, innocence, and freedom were sacrifices expected of those born into royal blood. For this little girl, her marriage was not just a personal loss, it was the erasure of her youth. Imagine being led into a towering cathedral, its Gothic arches looming above like guardians of a destiny you never chose. The candles flicker, shadows dance on stone walls, and solemn priests chant the sacred words of union. In that moment, what should have been a day of games, laughter, and innocence instead became the day her life changed forever. Instead of holding toys, she held the hand of a king, a man old enough to be her father. Instead of playing with friends, she was surrounded by courtiers, nobles, and priests, each one a witness to her stolen childhood. In medieval England, such arrangements were not seen as shocking. Royal marriages were tools of diplomacy, designed to secure lands, forge alliances, and strengthen dynasties. But even by the standards of the time, this particular marriage raised whispers. A child bride was not just a symbol of innocence lost, she was also a reminder of how ruthless the politics of the crown could be. Kings and queens were not free to love. They were pawns, moved across the chessboard of Europe by powerful families seeking to control the future. For the king, marrying a 6-year-old girl was not about companionship. It was about consolidating his power, ensuring that his throne remained secure, and binding rival families to his reign. For the girl's family, giving their daughter to the king meant prestige, influence, and perhaps even protection. But for the girl herself, it meant the sudden end of her childhood. What makes her story even more tragic is how quickly she was forgotten. Historians remember the kings who fought wars, signed treaties, and built empires. But the voices of child brides, silenced before they could tell their stories, remain buried in the shadows of history. This queen's life became a footnote, a detail in the background of a larger narrative. And yet, when we look closely, we see that her story reveals something far greater: the cost of power in a world that demanded sacrifice from the most innocent. Think about it. What does it mean to be 6 years old? At that age, a child is still learning how to read, how to write, how to play, and imagine. They are still discovering who they are. But for her, those simple joys were stolen, replaced by the crushing weight of duty. The crown on her head was not a gift, it was a burden. The ring on her finger was not a token of love, It was a chain. This forgotten Queen of England reminds us that history is not always glorious. Behind the royal processions and golden crowns lie stories of pain, silence, and stolen childhoods. Her marriage to a man 29 years old may have secured a king's power, but it came at the highest cost: the life of a little girl who never had the chance to be just that, a little girl. And so, as we begin this journey into her story, we must remember, history is not only about kings and their victories. It is also about the hidden tragedies, the silenced voices, and the forgotten figures who were forced to play roles in games they never chose. This is the story of a queen who was crowned too soon, married too young, and remembered too little. Her childhood was stolen. Her voice was silenced. But her story deserves to be told. To understand why a 6-year-old girl was married off to a king almost 5 times her age, we have to look beyond the innocence of childhood and step into the ruthless world of medieval politics. Royal marriages in medieval Europe were rarely about love, companionship, or personal choice. Instead, they were about alliances, power, and the survival of dynasties. Every bride and groom was a piece on the grand chessboard of kingdoms, a pawn, a knight, or sometimes a queen to be sacrificed for the sake of the crown. In the case of this forgotten queen, her marriage was not a romantic union, but a carefully calculated move. The king, a man of 29, stood at a point in his reign where securing loyalty and strengthening his hold on the throne was more important than anything else. His enemies were not only foreign invaders, but also rival nobles within his own land, each waiting for the slightest weakness to exploit. By marrying this little girl, he was not choosing a partner for his heart, but forging a bond that tied powerful families to his throne. For the child's family, this marriage was both an honor and a political necessity. To give a daughter to the king was to elevate one's house, to secure royal favor, and to ensure a seat closer to the heart of power. It was also a shield, for proximity to the crown often meant protection from rival lords and political threats. Yet this honor came at the cost of their daughter's freedom, her childhood traded for influence and prestige. The ceremony itself may have been cloaked in the sacred language of the church, but at its core, it was a political contract. Each candlelit in the cathedral was less about divine blessing and more about political symbolism. The king needed the legitimacy of marriage to reinforce his image as a ruler chosen not only by blood but also by God. The bride's family needed the public display of union to cement their rise in the social hierarchy. And the nobles who witnessed it were reminded of the king's growing network of alliances. This was the brutal logic of the age. Personal happiness meant little when weighed against the stability of kingdoms. In fact, medieval chroniclers rarely even mentioned whether a marriage was happy or not. Instead, they spoke of dowries, inheritances, and treaties signed as a result of these unions. Love was irrelevant. Strategy was everything. The tragedy lies in how normal such practices were considered. In a world where life was fragile, where war and disease could end dynasties overnight, rulers acted with ruthless efficiency. Marrying off a child was not seen as cruelty, it was seen as survival. And yet, when we look back with modern eyes, we cannot help but see the cruelty clearly. We see a child robbed of her innocence, placed into a role she could not possibly understand, her life dictated by the ambitions of others. For the king, this marriage was also about legacy. A monarch without heirs was a monarch whose reign was constantly in danger. Rivals circled like wolves, waiting for the throne to be weakened by uncertainty. By binding himself to a powerful family through this child bride, the king was securing both his present and his future. Even if children would not come from the union for many years, the symbolic bond was enough to stabilize his position. Meanwhile, the young bride became more of a symbol than a person. She represented peace between two powerful factions, a living treaty that reminded everyone of the king's influence. She was paraded in court, crowned with jewels that weighed more than her small frame, not as a child but as a queen in name. Her laughter was replaced by silence, her playfulness overshadowed by the expectations of nobility. This chessboard was vast, and every piece mattered. A wrong move could spark rebellion, foreign invasion, or civil war. And so, sacrifices were made, not by the rulers themselves, but by those too young and powerless to resist. This child queen was one such sacrifice, a pawn placed strategically on the board, destined to carry the weight of decisions made by men who valued power above innocence. Looking back, we might ask, could things have been different? Could the king have chosen another bride, closer to his age, capable of ruling alongside him? Perhaps. But in the eyes of medieval rulers, it was not about companionship. It was about control. And a child bride, too young to resist, too innocent to challenge authority, was the perfect vessel for such control. Thus, the marriage of this forgotten queen was less a story of love and more a cold calculation of gain and loss. It shows us the darker side of monarchy, where crowns were not symbols of glory, but reminders of the sacrifices demanded for power. In the end, the political chessboard of medieval England was unforgiving. Every piece moved with purpose, and every sacrifice was justified in the name of the throne. For the 6-year-old girl who became queen, her life was no longer her own. She was no longer a child. She was a pawn in a game too vast for her to understand. The day of the wedding dawned like no other, a day that should have been filled with laughter, games, and childish delight, but instead carried the weight of destiny. In the heart of a medieval cathedral, beneath stone arches that had witnessed centuries of prayers and coronations, a child was about to be transformed into a queen. At only 6 years old, she could not have understood the meaning of the vows she was about to take, yet the world around her celebrated this union as a triumph of politics and power. Imagine the scene. The cathedral is vast, echoing with chants of monks as incense drifts through the air. Long candles burn brightly, casting flickering shadows on the cold stone walls. Nobles and courtiers, dressed in silks and velvets, fill the aisles, their eyes fixed on the little girl who enters in a gown too heavy for her tiny frame. The fabric glitters with gold embroidery, the crown upon her head pressing down like an anchor. To the crowd, she is not a child. She is a symbol, an emblem of alliance, the vessel of a dynasty's future. The king stands at the altar, towering in comparison, a man of 29 with the presence of authority and the weight of rule etched into his face. His robes of blue and crimson shimmer beneath the glow of the candles, a living representation of power. He is not nervous, nor is he overjoyed. This marriage is not about emotion. For him, it is duty, strategy, and survival. The child is led by attendants, perhaps even clutching the hand of a nursemaid or relative, her eyes wide as she looks up at the vaulted ceilings and the sea of faces staring at her. She may not even fully understand why she is there. To her, this might feel like a grand festival or an important ceremony, but not marriage as we know it today. And yet, before the eyes of the court and the church, she is declared the king's lawful wife. The ritual unfolds with solemnity. A bishop raises his hands, invoking blessings in Latin. The child bride repeats words she cannot truly comprehend, guided gently by those beside her. When the time comes for the exchange of rings, the moment becomes almost unbearable to imagine. A small, delicate hand extended, upon which the king places a symbol of lifelong union. To the audience, it is an act of divine order. To us, it is the tragic binding of innocence to duty. After the vows, the congregation erupts in applause and celebration. Musicians strike their lutes, drums echo through the hall, and voices rise in songs of joy. Yet the contrast between the joyous noise and the silent bewilderment of the little bride could not be greater. She is paraded down the aisle, side by side with the king, while courtiers whisper about the political brilliance of the match. For them, this is not a tragedy. It is a victory. The feast that follows is lavish. Tables groan beneath the weight of roasted meats, golden goblets of wine, and spiced breads. Nobles raise their cups to the health of the new queen, praising her beauty, her lineage, and the fortune she brings to the throne. But amid the laughter and merriment, one detail is easy to forget. The queen they are celebrating is a child who cannot even taste the wine being poured in her honor. Such was the reality of medieval politics. The church sanctified the union, the nobility endorsed it, and the people celebrated it, all while ignoring the tender age of the bride. To them, this was not scandalous, it was necessary. In a world where kingdoms rose and fell on alliances, such sacrifices were expected. But history, when stripped of the grandeur, shows us the human cost. We may never know exactly what the child thought that day. Did she feel fear as she stood before the towering king? Did she feel confusion at the strange words spoken over her? Or perhaps she was too young to even grasp the gravity of the moment, swept away in a tide of ritual and celebration. What we do know is that her life changed forever. With a crown on her head and a ring on her finger, she ceased to be a child in the eyes of the world. The wedding ceremony marked the beginning of her transformation, not into a woman, not into a partner, but into a symbol of power. Her body, her presence, even her silence became tools in the game of kings and lords. And while the cathedral bells rang in triumph, they also tolled for the loss of something that could never be restored, the innocence of childhood. This day, so celebrated in its time, remains one of the most haunting chapters of her life. A wedding that should have been a joyous union was instead a political maneuver. A crown that should have been a reward became a burden. And a child who should have been free to play in gardens and learn her letters was instead thrust into history as the youngest bride of a king. The wedding was only the beginning. Once the ceremony ended and the celebration faded, the reality of life as a child queen began. And that reality was far from the fairy tale image that most people imagine when they hear the word queen. For this little girl, barely 6 years old, her crown was not a symbol of glory, it was a cage. In the royal court, her every move was watched, her every word measured. She was no longer free to laugh, run, or play as a child might. Instead, she was placed under the constant gaze of attendants, governesses, and advisors who ensured that she behaved with the dignity expected of a queen. Imagine being a child told not to giggle too loudly, not to fidget, not to speak out of turn. The natural curiosity and energy of youth were smothered beneath the heavy expectations of royalty. Her daily life was dictated by ceremony. From the moment she awoke, she was dressed in layers of ornate gowns, fabrics so heavy they restricted her movements. Meals were taken in the presence of nobles, where even the simple act of eating was governed by etiquette far too complex for a child to grasp. Lessons in manners, languages, and prayers filled her hours, while the warmth of family and the joy of friendship remained distant dreams. Most tragically, her role as queen was not symbolic alone. Even as a child, she was expected to embody the dignity of the throne. Foreign envoys and noble visitors would look upon her as the living face of England's alliances. Her smile, her posture, even her silence were interpreted as reflections of the king's strength and the stability of his reign. The pressure on her small shoulders was immense. And what of the king, her husband of 29 years? Their relationship was not that of a man and wife as we understand it today. It was instead that of ruler and symbol. The king needed her presence to legitimize his power, to demonstrate that he had secured a noble alliance, and to silence rival factions. She was his queen, but she was also his possession, a piece of the political machinery that kept his crown secure. The contrast between her private reality and her public image was stark. Behind closed doors, she may have remained a frightened child, missing the comfort of her parents, longing for play and laughter. But in public, she had to walk with grace, sit in silence, and carry herself with a dignity far beyond her years. Childhood tantrums, tears, or mischief were not tolerated, for the court was not a nursery. It was a stage upon which kingdoms rose and fell. As years passed, the court began to prepare her for the role she would one day play more fully. Tutors instructed her in languages, history, and the complex traditions of royal diplomacy. She was groomed not to be a wife in the personal sense, but to be a queen who represented continuity, legitimacy, and political unity. Yet every lesson, every expectation, pushed her further from the childhood she had never truly lived. We must remember that the medieval court was a place of intrigue, competition, and constant danger. Every noble sought influence, Every advisor had an agenda, and every alliance was fragile. For the young queen, this meant growing up in an environment where trust was rare and innocence could be easily exploited. She was surrounded not by playmates, but by ambitious men and women who saw her as a tool in their quest for power. Psychologically, the toll of such a life must have been immense. Modern psychology tells us that children need play, affection, and freedom to grow into healthy adults. This queen had none of that. Instead, she was forced into a rigid role that demanded obedience and suppressed her natural development. The result was a kind of isolation that no crown could ever compensate for. Despite the constraints, the little queen became an enduring symbol in the eyes of her people. Festivals celebrated her presence, poems praised her beauty, and chronicles recorded her as part of the royal lineage. Yet behind those grand depictions was the hidden truth. She was a child trapped in the role of a monarch, a living sacrifice to the ambitions of her family and her king. Her story is not unique. Across medieval Europe, child queens and princesses were used as pawns in political games. But her case stands out because of the stark contrast between her tender age and the immense responsibilities thrust upon her. While other children played in fields or learned their letters, she was navigating the treacherous waters of court life, burdened with expectations she could never fully meet. Life as a child queen was not a fairy tale. It was a tragedy dressed in silk and gold. She lived in castles but lacked freedom. She wore crowns but carried no joy, and she was celebrated by all but loved by none. Her life reminds us that behind the splendor of monarchy lay a darkness rarely spoken of, the sacrifice of innocence at the altar of power. Every story has an ending. For kings, that ending often lies in battles won, treaties signed, or dynasties secured. But for queens, especially child queens, their endings are far quieter, hidden in the margins of history books. Our forgotten queen, married at just 6 years old to a man nearly 5 times her age, lived a life that was defined not by her own choices, but by the ambitions of others. And when her role in the great game of power was no longer useful, history simply let her fade into silence. Unlike kings, who were immortalized in chronicles and celebrated in songs, child queens were often reduced to footnotes. They existed not as individuals, but as symbols of alliances, treaties, and dynasties. Once their political importance diminished, so too did the attention they received. Our young queen, despite wearing a crown, became invisible in the annals of time. The very same historians who carefully recorded the details of her wedding wrote little about her life thereafter. She was remembered not for who she was, but for what she represented. This is the cruel paradox of power. A crown that could make a child appear larger than life could also erase her humanity. The people saw her at festivals, in processions, in portraits, but they did not see the child behind the jewels. They celebrated her beauty and grace, yet ignored the fact that she had been denied the simple joys of childhood. And when her role was no longer politically relevant, the memory of her existence slipped quietly into the shadows. Why was she forgotten? The answer lies in the very nature of medieval politics. History favored action, conquest, and dominance. Kings who expanded their realms or defended their thrones were remembered. Queens who produced heirs or influenced policy occasionally left their mark. But child queens, too young to shape events directly, were rarely acknowledged as individuals. Their marriages were transactions, and once those transactions were complete, their personal stories no longer mattered. Yet, from a modern perspective, her story is far from meaningless. In fact, it reveals the darkest truths about power in medieval England. Her life is a testimony to how far families and rulers were willing to go in their quest for influence, even at the cost of childhood itself. Today, when we look back, we are forced to confront uncomfortable questions. How many children were sacrificed in similar ways? How many lives were shaped and destroyed by decisions made in pursuit of crowns and thrones? Her legacy, though obscured, survives in the silence she left behind. That silence speaks volumes. It reminds us that history is not just made of kings and warriors, but also of those who suffered quietly in the background. Her life, though forgotten, is a mirror reflecting the injustices of her time. And perhaps that is why her story resonates so strongly today. In an era where we value childhood, where we recognize the importance of innocence and growth, the idea of a 6-year-old being forced into marriage feels unimaginable. It shocks us, unsettles us, and forces us to rethink the grandeur of the medieval world. Behind the castles and crowns were tragedies, behind the pageantry were sacrifices, and behind every great king was often a forgotten queen. The crown she wore was heavy, not because of its gold and jewels, but because of what it symbolized: the weight of lost childhood, the burden of political games, and the silence of a life unlived. She may not have left behind great speeches or famous deeds, but her story is no less important. It compels us to give voice to those who had none, to remember those whom history chose to forget. In the end, her legacy is not written in victories or defeats, but in the lessons her life teaches us. Power without humanity is cruelty. Politics without compassion is tragedy. And history without the voices of the silenced is incomplete. So, when we think of medieval England, let's not only remember the kings who ruled and the wars they fought. Let us also remember the little girl who became a queen too soon, who was crowned before she ever understood the meaning of power, and who was forgotten by the very history she helped shape. Her name may not echo in grand histories, but her story, of innocence lost, of silence imposed, of a life overshadowed by politics, remains one of England's most haunting secrets. A queen forgotten by her time, but remembered now as a symbol of both the beauty and the cruelty of the past.